Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, David.
And we are thrilled to be joined on this Tuesday by Maximillian Alvarez. You know him from the Real News Network and Working People's podcast. How you doing, brother? Thanks so much for joining us on Left Reckoning today.
Thanks so much, brother. It's great to be on here. Love everything you guys do. Good to see you. And what a day we're having, right?
I know we did, when we asked you to come on, we didn't know we'd be getting this news this morning. So thank you for taking some time. In a little bit, we're going to talk about a guy who doesn't know very much about labor. But while we have somebody who does know a decent amount about American labor, Max, we were hoping if you could give our audience a sense about why this is such a big day regarding the Teamsters negotiations. As people know, we've been covering this a lot on the program, a lot of the demands. But right now, it seems like there's a tentative agreement. And I was just curious, Max, if you wanted to sort of talk about, how you're feeling about it, whether or not people should feel very optimistic, what's in it. I mean, just give us your general kind of recap of the moment right here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give my live impressions as best as I can. But I guess to make the point about why this is such a flustering moment, is I'm in here, as folks can see, I'm in the green room of the Real News because I've got the great Teddy Ostro, host of the Upsurge podcast, where he and Ruby Walsh have been covering the UPS contract fight for the past year in a really incredible, in-depth way. And so if folks are trying to make sense of this, obviously go back and rewatch the coverage from Left Reckoning. Check out the episodes on Working People, my podcast, where I've interviewed UPSers, including a couple recent episodes where we talk about the contract fight. But definitely make time to go check out the Upsurge podcast. It's a really invaluable production that we at the Real News we're excited to, co-sponsor and syndicate along with the great folks at In These Times magazine. So Teddy and I, after all that year of work on that podcast, we brought Teddy down here to Baltimore for the Real News because we're hosting a live stream tonight, which was billed as, we're a week away from potentially one of the biggest strikes in U.S. history. We're talking 340,000 Teamster UPS workers, full-time and part-time around the country, right? This is, like a really kind of seismic contract dispute that I think we've all acknowledged, is going to play a significant role in determining where the labor movement goes from here, right? Because the drama within this UPS contract fight itself is very, I think, representative of where organized labor is in general in this country. Again, I won't go into the whole backstory. You can listen to our respective coverages about that, but we're talking about the Teamsters. We're talking about Jimmy Hoffa, a storied union with a long and, checkered past, let's put it lightly. But also very much a symbol of the labor movement, a symbol of a bygone, more militant working or more organized working class. Right. It's been a long road from Jimmy Hoffa to Sean O'Brien, the current president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Sean O'Brien himself was voted in about a year and a half ago through a reform slate because the membership of the Teamsters said that they didn't want any more of the Hoffa legacy because it was Jimmy Hoffa's son who was the previous president of the Teamsters. And in fact, he was a tentpole of, the kind of business unionism, concessionary bargaining, the sort of, lack of rank and file militancy that, we've been seeing permeate the labor movement essentially for our entire lifetimes, right? We all know that, from the late 70s, early 80s on, organized labor in this country has been on a nosedive decline to the point that we are barely hovering above 10% union density in this country, 6% in the private sector, which is frankly abysmal. So labor, and that was a long drawn out process. That wasn't just deindustrialization, though that was a big part of it. That wasn't just globalization, though that was a big part of it. But it was also kind of really changing attitudes from Wall Street, from corporate America, from, the Democrats who used to be more of a supporter of organized labor. Even a lot of Republicans used to be as well. But the political might of labor has waned in that same time that the just collective organized worker power represented through different unions, that has also been in decline over the past 40, 50 years, at the same time that we've been seeing union membership go down, yet productivity has been going up. People in this country have been working longer, they've been working harder, they've been producing more profits and revenue for our employers. Yet what we have seen is, with the decline of union density, with workers more or less being on their own, not being protected by collective bargaining agreements or having the collective strength of a union, all of that excess productivity, like practically all of it, has been siphoned into the pockets of the 1%, into the pockets of Wall Street and corporate America, stashed in tax havens in the US and outside of the US. We have been getting robbed left and right for decades. And I'm sad to say that, a number of unions and union leaderships, have played a part in that decline. Now, we could have a whole conversation about whether or not they felt that was the best they could do at the time, whether or not they, in fact did sell their members out for unsavory reasons or corruption or self-serving, what have you. We don't have to get into that right now. The point is, though, is that we've been on this backslide. Union density has been declining. Wealth inequality has been exploding. And corporate America, is out for blood. They want to take everything they possibly can. They want to they want to eliminate unions in this country entirely, right? And we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a second. So this is the situation that we were in. We haven't even talked about COVID-19, but this is where we were when the last UPS Teamsters contract was up 5 years ago. And that was a contract, in fact, that the membership had rejected. And James P. Hoffa actually invoked, they did some really shady shit. They invoked some kind of special powers within the Teamsters rules, and they rammed the contract through against the will of their members. So you had a lot of people pissed off about this, rightfully so, which is why Sean O'Brien and the reform slate got voted in a year and a half ago, which is why workers have been far more mobilized, energetic, and ready to fight when the contract negotiations with UPS came up again in 2023. I think that that's a very exciting thing to see, regardless of where we end up with this contract. The news that you mentioned at the top is that as of today, this is July 25th. Like I said, we had Teddy Ostro come down here. We were going to do this live stream we're a week away from a strike. Then we heard at noon today that a tentative agreement had been reached between the union and UPS. And so we're trying to figure out what's in it. Because right now, so far, the details of that tentative agreement have not been made public. There are tons of members who have not seen it as well. So a lot of people, commenting on it, I would just stress people to kind of have a little patience. I know it's frustrating. We want to know what's in this, but we don't have the details yet. So there's a lot of hearsay. There's a lot of speculation. But I'll just to kind of quickly sum up, and then I promise I'll shut up.
No, please, I want you.
I'll read actually a nice succinct kind of breakdown from Teddy and Stephen Franklin. This was from a piece that we co-published within These Times today, a short update on the TA being reached. And so they write, quote, "The tentative agreement, which must be ratified by a vote of Teamsters members, includes what the union describes as a, quote, historic wage increase for full-time and part-time UPS Teamsters. The end of a despised two-tier wage system among delivery drivers," those are the 22-4 drivers, the creation of thousands of new full-time union jobs, the targeted installation of air conditioning in new package cars, i.e. those purchased after January 1st, 2024, and other measures to protect drivers against the heat. Also, limitations on forced overtime and Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a paid holiday, among other measures, right? So those are the talking points that we've got from the union so far. There are some other details in there that I would encourage folks to check out, including some more fine-grained details about what these wage increases are actually going to mean. So like, I think the biggest increase is going to be immediately felt for part-timers. Their wages are going to immediately go from $21 an hour to $23 an hour. Supposedly, according to the press release today, they will average $27 an hour over the course of the 5 years of the contract's lifetime. Package car drivers will also see a pay bump, but that will be, I believe, from a couple dollars from 42 to 47 an hour. So the devil's really going to be in the details, but I mean, and you're not going to have everyone happy about this because you've got such a massive bargaining unit with people in the package cars, 2 tiers of people driving those package cars, people in the warehouses, people like at all kinds of tiers doing similar work, but making wildly different amounts for that work. And that was really kind of at the crux of this fight, was like to try to condense and eliminate those tiers that have become such a rampant force in UPS, but we've also seen 2, 3, 4 tier systems become a plague in and become a really big rallying cry for other workers who have gone on strike of late, including John Deere workers. The 2-tier system there was a critical rallying point for their strike. You've got Kellogg's workers who were fighting with their strike against 2-tier employment system as well. CNH Industrial, the higher education strikes that we've been seeing. Higher ed is like 50 tiers, right? Going from master's students to PhD students, to lecturers, to adjuncts, to non-tenure track faculty, yada, 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 right? So the fight against 2-tier or multi-tier employment systems, i.e. for those who like are maybe not into the jargon, like it's just like, the fight for equal pay for equal work, right? That has been, I think, a big motivating factor in this contract fight, which also like is very representative of a lot of the other contract fights that we've been seeing of late. A renewed labor militancy after a period of,
did we lose Max for a second?
there we go.
Oh, sorry, did I cut out?
We lost you for a little bit
I
there.
think it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I talked enough.
Max, I'm curious. You mentioned like these different levels within this union, and I'm curious because Working People's Pod has such an important place. I'm curious your philosophy and like what's appropriate, because obviously if the rank and file vote against membership, that's easy, right? Like we support the rank and file. It's harder if it's like a very close vote, for instance, when a lot of people, particularly like our audiences, are really hungering for like militant labor action. So I'm just curious how you approach these things.
Well, it's a really great question, and I appreciate one of the reasons I love your guys' show, right, is because you actually think about these things, right? Because you can tell when pundits and pontificators, it's not important to them, right? They just want the clicks, they want the outrage, they want what they want more than they want what the workers want. And I think that is ultimately my North Star, is that, you need to know your place. And like you are not the leader of this union. You're not the leader of any movement. You are not the spokesperson for any class or movement or union or what have you. You are a journalist, right? I mean, like, and you ultimately have to recognize where that line is beyond which it is no longer your place to say anything, frankly. So like this is something that came up a lot when, as you mentioned, the railroad workers last year were in the midst of their own high stakes contract fight. I think we all remember what happened there, but I covered this extensively at The Real News and my podcast, Working People, the segment I do at Breaking Points. My colleague Mel Buer and I were really kind of tag teaming the coverage of the crisis on the freight rail system. As the contract negotiations between the 12 unions representing over 100,000 freight rail workers and the cartel of Class 1 freight rail carriers were trying to negotiate their contract. By that point, those contract negotiations had been going on for 3 years because labor relations on the railroads are not governed by the National Labor Relations Act. So there's a whole lot of extra provisions and crap that we don't have to get into right now. But anyway, we almost got to a national rail shutdown in September, when you could have seen a strike initiated by the rail unions or a lockout initiated by the rail carriers. And in fact, the rail carriers jumped the gun and illegally started implementing a soft lockout a week before they were legally able to do so. But because no one in the media knew shit about labor or the railroads, none of them were even calling them out on it. But that's a story for another day. So we went through that whole thing, and then we came up to the point where a number of unions had voted against the tentative agreement that was reached in September, that was brokered by the Biden administration, and kind of postponed what was an impending national rail shutdown in late September. Kicked the ball down the road to late November, early December. That's when scab Joe Biden and Democrats and Republicans in Congress conspired to crush the rail workers from striking and force an agreement that they didn't want down their throats, and effectively endorse all the greedy and destructive practices that have destroyed the rail industry while making record profits for rail executives and their shareholders, right? So in the midst of all of that, when, folks were really hungry for information about which way the different unions were going to vote, because this was very complicated, right? Because on the rail system, if one of those unions goes on strike, it will effectively trigger a rail shutdown because all the other unions have provisions not to cross picket lines, right? So you didn't need all 12 unions. You didn't even need the biggest of those unions, like the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen or Smart TD, to be the ones to go on strike. Without, you didn't need the big ones to go on strike to cause a national rail shutdown. And so you had what you were talking about there, Matt. You actually had some unions vote the tentative agreement down, some pass it, but by extremely narrow margins. And like what workers would kind of tell me in that case is that, a lot more people probably would have voted this down if they thought that Biden and Congress would let them strike in the first place, but they didn't. And so they voted for it just because they felt like, this has been going on for 3 years now. I want my back wages. I'm tired of having this fight, and they're not going to let us fight anyway. And so there you're in an interpretive position, right? Where people are asking you, what is the membership saying? You can try to synthesize that, communicate it, and let people know the calculus that rank and file workers are making. But I think if you call yourself a journalist, if you believe yourself to be at least nominally beholden to any semblance of journalistic principles, and also, if you believe yourself, if you're honest with yourself about your role as someone in the media who is supportive of the movement, wants to see the movement grow, wants to see workers win, but needs to know your place, then that's a moment where I would tell people, I was like, here's what workers have told me. But ultimately, it's not my place to say how they should vote, right? Because I'm not in their position, right? And it's not my union. Right. And frankly, there are a lot of discussions and hard decisions that need to be made between people's families, their coworkers. And again, I want workers to have everything. That's where I stand. But I also respect people as human beings with individual agency. And any good organizer will tell you, like, you cannot violate that principle. You have to always respect people's agency. You can't control people. You can't tell them what to do. They have to be the ones to kind of walk through that door themselves. They have to make the decisions themselves. You just got to keep being there for them and support them either way, even if they don't make the decision that you want to. So I think like ultimately there's a long-winded way of saying that in cases like these, I want workers to have everything. If there are people who are being short shrifted by this contract, and that is still a very real possibility, because if part-timer pay goes up, that's great. But if there are no provisions for minimum hours, then UPS is just going to offset those fucking hours so that they're essentially taking home the same amount every week. Maybe like they'll get a little bit more, right? Or like UPS, as they did with the past contracts, they're saying we're going to create 7,000 new positions in the company, full-time positions. Past contracts, they said it's going to be 10,000, it's going to be 5,000, whatever. Then everyone forgets about it. They don't have to meet those like requirements. And in fact, UPS never does. They just say, as part of this new deal, we're going to create X number of new full-time jobs. And then people forget about it by the time, you know, the contract is in effect. So there are plenty of ways that workers can still get screwed over here. But I mean, the Teamsters have pulled a lot of concessions out of UPS. That also should not be forgotten here, right? I mean, because, go.
No, sorry. I was just gonna say, and like one thing that we've been covering here too is that like this is like a good example, right? Regardless of what even ends up happening with the final contract, the ratification, like just the success that we've been able to see from the outside of like the things that have been able to be negotiated in this contract, that's good for the UAW, for example, right? Like, you know, like this is a major event. This Teamster struggle is a major event, but it's also a major event in what seems to be a big wave of major events in labor. And I think particularly for people who are just sort of maybe watching this as a pro-labor person, in general, like understand that this is a part of like this massive wave that's happening right now. And these are like, you know, these are victories in pushing this movement forward. In the general sense, like this gives people confidence, because look, there's no doubt about it that the fact that across the country, Teamsters doing a practice strike, for example, like plays a role in these contract negotiations, right? You know, regardless of if you think this is the right contract or not, it's like this scares the bosses, right? And these are things that weren't happening as much 4 or 5 years ago that are very, very good, productive, like changes.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Because also like, I know the and we don't even have to talk about Obama. We can do that another time. But like if we're talking about like what this says about where the movement is and where we could go from here, right? Again, there's so much in the UPS contract fight that is indicative of what so many other workers are going through around the country, especially after COVID-19. Right. Because think about it, for everyone watching and listening, like to state the obvious, when COVID hit, that was a boon to the e-commerce model. That's why Amazon, you know, like saw its profits like soar, and you know, the wealth of, you know, Jeff Bezos and other, you know, like oligarchs just exploded over the past 3 years. And it was UPS and FedEx, you know, like, and delivering those packages, right? And so you had workers, in the warehouses, workers in the package cars, risking their lives like all other essential workers to keep the economy running. And a lot of people died. A lot of people got sick. They were having all of this, you know, additional work piled onto them. It was a really, really brutal 3 years for UPS workers. That, I think, is the consistent theme throughout all the UPS workers I've talked to, is they say it has been a rough few years for us, and we deserve more than what we are currently getting. And we made this company over $100 billion in revenue in 2022 alone. Like, think about that. $100 billion in 1 year in revenue. And like, then UPS was coming to the table, like, you know, with these like BS sort of proposals on the economic issues. That's why the, you know, Teamsters were really playing hardball with them, just like John Deere workers were when they voted 2 tentative agreements down about 2 years ago, because they were like, no. like you are more profitable than you've ever been. You have the money. We see it. We're making it for you. Like, you need to put up, and we need to be compensated for all that we have done to make you those profits.
And I feel like one thing that has been really like positive, just from like a media analysis thing, is like Sean O'Brien has been really good at hitting those talking points when he's on air. Like, really good about talking about profit in a way that I think is maybe different from the way like maybe even like a typical liberal or Democrat might describe it. I mean, really using kind of class terms as to where the money's going and who's producing it. That I think, yeah, it's just like very beneficial for, one, the Teamsters movement, and two, just generally, it's good to have somebody on Fox
The
Business
discourse.
talking about, you know, UPS is basically taking money from the people who produce the wealth for the company, right?
No, it's huge. I mean, we saw it with Mick Lynch and the RMT in the UK. Like, if you've got someone who's really effective at navigating the corporate media propaganda or its state-owned, you know, BBC kind of propaganda, like, it can really have an impact for people who just don't ever get that kind of sharp, succinct perspective on the media that they watch, right? And that is a huge difference between, like, say, now and 1997, when the Teamsters, UPS workers last went on strike, right? I mean, because I was a conservative in 1997 in Southern California. We had Fox News on all the time. It was like a new thing. We had right-wing radio on all the time. But even on the other like news channels, it was all just sort of like, how is this going to hurt the consumer? Right? How are you, the consumer, going to be inconvenienced by this? And the Teamsters, to their credit, were able to circumvent that and flip the kind of anti-worker, anti-union propaganda in 1997 on its head with the phrase "part-time America won't work." Right? That was their rallying cry. And people, workers around the country were feeling that message because they were also feeling the explosion of part-time and, you know, what, less than full-time, more precarious work. You know, they were seeing their wages stagnate even though they were working longer and harder. And, you know, we were going through the realestate.com boom, so on and so forth. Right. So like the phrase, and the concept that for working people to have a comfortable, dignified life and to not spend every waking moment of their lives working just to get by and just to scrape by to make ends meet. But in fact, we deserve more than that. That was able to rally enough people who in their own lives were feeling that same squeeze and identify their situation with that of the UPS workers who were on strike. And they won, you know, major concessions at that point. And after that, sadly, is when we really started seeing the kind of reactionary, concessionary backslide within the Teamsters itself. But what I think you're seeing now, which is really something to seize on. It's a moment of opportunity for all of us. I'm talking all of us on the left, all of us in media, all of us in labor. We have a window here that's not going to come again. We have a tight labor market. We have a post-pandemic sort of like energy and resentment, a good resentment that I think is fueling a lot of working people to say, hey, we sacrificed to make, not only, we thought we were sacrificing to keep the economy afloat. Now, 3 years later, we find out we were sacrificing and our friends died and our families died to make you pieces of shit record profits. And now you're trying to like come back to the bargaining table and ask for more concessions from us. And that is not going to play with us. Right. And so like, that's the kind of the what is it we say? The contradictions are intensifying, right? I mean, like the dialectic is in full swing right now because those sort of bloodthirsty executives and shareholders that have amassed so much wealth through the pandemic. It's truly mind-boggling how much more the ruling class has taken from us over the past 3 years, not even counting like Trump's tax cuts a couple years before that, right? But it has been a massive transfer of wealth upwards over the past decade, if not longer. And so you are reaching the point where the more powerful and the wealthy and that like, you know, and the more consolidated the business class becomes, because that was another effect of COVID-19 is a lot of middling and smaller businesses got wiped off the table, got absorbed into Amazon and other like massive behemoth entities like that, so on and so forth. And so as the market becomes increasingly dominated by, these different conglomerates, these, 2 or 3 mega corporations that aren't really competing with each other, right? So like when that even the fiction of competition in the market starts to fade, what you end up with is oligopoly. And you end up with like cartels, like on the railroads with the major class 1 freight rail carriers. They're not competing with each other. They all got their own portions of the country carved out. They got their the shippers who need to use the freight rail systems essentially locked in, and they have to use the rails, so they're going to pay whatever the railroads are charging, right? When you get a situation like that, you see capitalist true colors. They don't want to compete. They want to like put in the least amount of effort they possibly can and exploit the fewest amount of people they can for the maximum amount of output they can, so they can be stuffing as much as they can into their own goddamn pockets. And now the reason I think that this is an opportunity for us, because it's like it has to get this bad for us to kind of, stand up straight, clench our fists and really like fight back with the force that we need to fight back with, is that the more oligopolized the economy becomes, the more a sort of like non-competitive market emerges, dominated by, a few sort of oligopolistic entities, and they are not being regulated. They're not being, their antitrust like effectively doesn't exist anymore in this country. So what that means is that these same corporations that are screwing over their workers to make all those excess profits, and who feel so powerful that they can just steamroll any union or any uppity workers that get in their way, they are also taking advantage of their consumers, because they're like, well, if we're not competing with anyone, then we can just put out the lowest quality product, because where else are people going to go? Right. And that's where I think there's a really interesting kind of connection here, where a lot of consumers are on the worker side, because we are also, and it's also like we're all worker consumers anyway. There's no clean division between who we are as workers and who we are as consumers. Like we work, we make our wages, and then we go buy shit and consume, right? So we're all in that kind of same boat. But I think like from like the Hollywood strikes that are going on right now, the writers' strike, SAG-AFTRA, set workers with IATSE are like making moves as well. They are kind of pointing this out. They're saying the things that you guys hate about Hollywood, we hate it too, right? Because they are making it impossible for us to make a living as writers. They are creating these mini writing rooms that have fewer writers who are meant to pump out more work in less time, get fewer residuals through streaming services, so like they can't make a living. So they're squeezing us on the labor end, at the same time that like they're like forcing us to like pump out crap that, the billionth superhero movie, because all they want and care about is profits. And so, and now even when they're talking about integrating AI into the filmmaking process, what they are admitting to you, the consumer, is that it's not going to be good. It's going to be cheap. It's going to be cheap, and you're going to take it because you're not going to have anywhere else to go. And so the more that we can fuse the sort of consumer rage and the worker rage at the same people who are trying to squeeze us on both ends, right? That I think really like builds the potential for a revolt against corporate America and the corporate destruction of everything, which is like, that's what we're up against right now.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's an important point. And, I think it's something that sometimes we miss on the left. We just did a big thing on Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution. And one thing that I was just thinking about when you were talking is that, like, she writes a lot about consumers, actually, which seems strange. You wouldn't expect it maybe in like an early 20th century Marxist text, but it's in there. I think it's worthwhile to strategize around that. But Max, I know you got a lot going on this evening. Thank you so much for joining us today on Left Reckoning and all the great work you do on Working People's Pod and the Real News Network. It's always a pleasure talking with you, brother.
Thanks, brothers. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Max.
Solidarity from Baltimore, guys.
All right.